Space. The final frontier.
These are the voyages
of the Starship
Enterprise.
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 No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Enterprise.
Deep Space Nine.
Defiant.
Voyager.
Discovery.
Cerritos. Protostar.
Titan.
Your ongoing mission
to explore
strange new worlds.
To seek out new life.
And new civilizations.
To boldly go
Where no man's gone
Where no one has gone
before.
Hello, everyone out there, and welcome back to Exploring Star Trek, where we are going to be talking about Strange New Worlds Episode 3, tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. And for those of you that have seen this episode with temporal paradoxes and are thinking that, wait a minute, haven't we seen you idiots review this episode already? Well, we had a wee bit of a technical problem, and Scott left a few hailing frequencies open that probably shouldn't have been, and we had to pull that video down. So if you have seen us review tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow on this channel, no, you haven't. And we're back here today to review it one more time. And this time I am joined by Justin. Justin, how are you?
Hey, you know what? I can't really complain. I'm not doing too shabby. And yeah, sorry, all you guys were expecting Blake and Scott are stuck with me instead. But we're going to have fun.
Yes, the people responsible for the audio department on the previous episode have been canned. Those of you who are Monty Python fans will get the reference. We'll just roll some credits later.
Those who are in charge of sacking the people have also been sacked.
So, Justin, what are your first thoughts? Let's jump right in here and get into our first thoughts on this week's episode.
Honestly, I'm not always a huge fan of a lot of the time travel episodes. That being said, Star Trek 4 was actually one of my favorite films as a kid. But since then, it's kind of been overdone. We had an entire season of it for Picard season 2. So when I realized this was a time travel episode, I just kind of sat back and rolled my eyes. I'm like, oh, okay, here we go. But actually, I freaking loved it. I liked how, anything relating around Khan, Noonien, and Singh, I tend to gravitate towards because he's one of my favorite villains / characters in the Star Trek universe. But just how they kind of work him into the story, and then also how they work in the Romulans and how they also, kind of partly explain why all the eugenics wars and the genocides and everything like that have been delayed. And it actually makes a lot of actually really cool sense. So I love the way they kind of help wrap up some lingering plot hole questions from across the Star Trek universe. And it was just really kind of chilling then to see Khan as an innocent child, knowing what he becomes, knowing who he becomes. And, kind of like the whole killing baby Hitler type paradox that I'm sure we'll probably get into a little bit later. But also one thing I loved because La'an is one of my favorite characters on the show, and just watching her kind of come to grips and come to terms with her ancestry and realizing she is actually in charge of her destiny. She's not beholden to anybody, and watching her kind of come out of this a much stronger person, and a little bit of shipping with her and alternate James T. Kirk that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later too. But I actually love this episode a lot more than I thought I was going to. And this is probably my second favorite episode of the season so far.
Yeah, and I will say for me, I really like the time travel episodes when they are episodes. The time travel season of Picard season 2, Scott and I've said this many times, is the first episode was great, the last episode was great, the middle 8 could have been condensed into like an hour and called it done. But yeah. So, they spent too long at it. So these one-off episodes of time travel, I actually really like. And there's been some good ones. I mean, look at Deep Space Nine. They had that two-parter where they went back. So there's ways that it gets done really well. My concern and fear with this episode is it feels a little bit like Star Trek has hit this idea of, in case of lack of original idea, break glass and pull out Khan type thing. Because we've had this where, at the end of Picard season 2, they pull yet another Soong relative pulls out a folder and it's Project Khan. They're talking about an audio podcast drama, which is Khan SETI Alpha 5. But it's not even Shudder Into Darkness, where we had Benedict Cumberbatch in The Shower of Evil as Khan. So it just seems like they pull out Khan again and again. But seeing the way they handled it in this episode, I think they did a really good job of it. Khan wasn't the supervillain in this. This was Khan. You're right. Khan is a child here. And what I really liked was the cleanup of the timeline, because it answered those questions. And to me, it tied in the temporal Cold Wars out of Enterprise. You had the references to that. And you had this concept of history of the timeline pushing back, which it's almost like these fixed point events that Khan's going to happen no matter what. It's destined to happen no matter what
the bootstrap paradox,
or the way it pushes.
Yeah, it's definitely the bootstrap paradox, I think, is definitely what they're using to try to wrap this all together, where, if you build a time machine to go back and change the past, well, by changing the past, you take away the reason why you ever invented the time machine in the first place. So the events are still going to occur. They may happen in different ways, but Khan is inevitable. Mm-hmm. And the Federation cannot exist without Khan. So I think that the way they did this was absolutely brilliant. And even Sarah, the Romulan, when she's standing there, holding the gun to La'an's head and saying, this was all supposed to happen back in 1992. Mm-hmm. I've been sitting around here for 30 years trying to get to this moment. Like, they even briefly touched upon it in the Terminator Terminator timelines, where you can't stop Judgment Day, you can only delay it. Yeah. So Skynet was an inevitability. Yeah. And very much here, the same thing with Khan and the eugenics wars. And I think that, again, they did a great way of going about it. And I will say that is the one annoyance I will say with Star Trek overall is if you watch the totality of Star Trek and all of the time travel that has happened, this franchise has absolutely no consistent philosophy of time travel. Yeah, they had an entire film about it. It breaks out to where between paradoxes and the way time travel works, it's whatever's convenient for the plot. There is no consistent philosophy of time travel in this show. Well, that's very true, because the theories about if you go back and you look even going into the late 80s when the Next Generation occurred, even going back to the original series with City on the Edge of Forever, which is our first Star Trek time travel episode. The theories about time travel had changed drastically over time, where you actually started to, even dating all the way back to when H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, and the first idea of this temporal paradox of you can't change the past first started kind of getting into the public psyche. So many times throughout many different genres of TV and film and literature and stuff like that, they've tried to pursue time travel, but you can kind of see over the past, 60 years, that the ideas of how time travel is supposed to work have changed constantly, and art has changed along with the science behind it, or pseudoscience, whatever you want to call it. So it doesn't really surprise me that there is a major inconsistency, because what we think about time travel has not been consistent as a society for the last several decades either. Well, I think we can agree one of the greatest lines about time travel in Star Trek was a drunken Deanna Troi in First Contact, going on about, we don't have the time to argue about time. Funk. So, and that's, again, like I said, another one of my favorite Star Trek films is 100% about time travel, and that's First Contact for sure. But again, that's something to where they toe some fine lines even in that film. So, but kind of, one of the major, and this is going to be silly, but one of the major observations I took away from this episode is I want that damn bridge. That Lake Ontario bridge, man.
Mhm.
Come on, USA and Canada. Come on,
Get that
Papa
bridge
Joe.
built.
Come on, Papa Joe and Trudeau. Let's make this happen. Because I've driven to Toronto. There's no easy way to get there from Indiana. It's about a 12-hour trip no matter which way you go, whether you go up through Detroit and cut across Ontario at Windsor, or whether you drive up to Buffalo and cut across at Niagara. There's no easy way to get there. If I can just drive across the whole damn lake and get to Toronto, that's a weekend trip right there. I love that city. I want to go back, but I just don't want to spend the time driving it or flying it. So
I will
let's
agree.
get that bridge built.
I had a lot of fun in Toronto when I was there for a conference.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, great town. We need to get that bridge, man. Let's do it. Start writing your congressmen and senators, people. Let's make it happen.
So this is yet another episode of Strange New Worlds where we see a familiar-ish character show up. So this is yet another alternate James T. Kirk that we have. Because you remember we had at the end of season 1 with the Balance of Terror redo, we had an alternate Kirk. And we see yet another Jim Kirk in this one. And I'm curious to get your thoughts, because I'll say for me, I'm not sold at this point. And I don't know why. So I've not...
On the actor?
And see, that's why I'm not sure, because I've not seen any of Paul Wesley's other work. Okay. So I don't know if it's the actor, or I don't know if it's a intentional decision of the writing, because I do keep reminding myself of this is a much younger Kirk than we've ever seen. This is not the Jim Kirk that is meant to be captain at this point, even though we see an alternate Kirk as captain in this. This is not the older Jim Kirk that we see as captain in the original series. So to me, there's just a lack of that certain swagger, that certain, presence that Shatner had, and even frankly, Chris Pine had in the 3 Abrams movies. That's the one thing I will say is Chris Pine as Kirk in those movies very much had that presence of, Captain Kirk, the swagger, that arrogant attitude that Kirk could have. And I'm just seeing this with Paul Wesley, I'm not getting that. So I don't know if it's an intentional character choice. I don't know if the actor just can't convey that or what.
I guess I don't have any major objections to the actor choice at all. To be honest, I don't think I'm not sure we've seen enough of him as captain of the Enterprise to make kind of a judgment one way or the other. He did have confidence, and he did have a little bit of swagger where he was actually having the time of his life in Toronto. He pretty much just dove right into it. When they needed some money, he found a way to make some money. And he owned some people.
Speaking of Toronto and money, by the way, I don't know how much chess his ass played, but to play enough chess to get a penthouse apartment in cash in Toronto, fuck me. I mean,
that's what I was thinking. I wrote that in my notes. I'm like, how much money did he win? I know how much hotels cost in Toronto.
Right? I remember what my bill was. Jesus, I didn't have that kind of a room either.
Yeah. One, they had to go and steal a bunch of clothes and then frame some poor lady for shoplifting so that they could get out of there. But the fact that, how much money did he make? But the fact that he walks in there and he's a man of decision. Like, this is what I think we should do, and let's go do it. So I can see a little bit of classic Kirk in there, but I don't feel like I've seen enough to make a call on him as like, this is the best person for James T. Kirk in this series. Because I would imagine someday we may end up, due to like some different foreshadowing and everything else we know about the Star Trek universe, we may eventually see Kirk take the chair. But I'm not 100% sold either, but I'm not discounting him. I actually want to see more out of him, because I love Sam in the series, and we'll get into that maybe talking about a little bit of a different episode in the future. But I think that I'm still wait and see mode with him.
Well, for me, I actually commented and I would like to wait and see too. What I've seen so far, I kind of have compared to a JFK knockoff more so than a take on James T. Kirk. And so I'd like to see a little more Kirk there. Is kind of what I'm hoping. Like I said, I'm hoping it's more of a writing decision than it is an actor thing, because I've just not seen any of other Paul Wesley's work to know which one it is at this point.
Right. But I can see what you're talking about with the whole JFK thing. But another character I actually really thought was interesting was Sarah, the person who they thought was the photographer
Mhm.
kind of saving their butts at the beginning, and then turns out was the Romulan agent behind the kind of the whole thing the entire time. She was an interesting character to start out with, but
Mhm.
then when she kind of reveals herself to be kind of the villain, a lot of it just kind of made sense as to where she always kind of happened to be in the right place in the right time, because she
Mhm.
was there making sure that things kind of transpired the way she wanted it to. But then also her reasons for being there and the fact that she had been there for over 30 years trying to put these events into motion, it just kind of I thought, now they made comments about her organization within the Romulan Empire. I kind of wonder if it's Tal Shiar, if we're kind of supposed to kind of get that feel for it, but nothing official was ever said. So I'm kind of curious as to if it does ever come back to that, if we start seeing some of the Tal Shiar involved in temporal events going forward, like we did like back in Enterprise and stuff like that.
Well, and I think there's also the possibility they've opened up in Picard with the Zat Vash as well with the
Oh yeah,
Romulans. So
yeah, that's
I agree.
actually
It could definitely be interesting to see where that goes. And I really hope this does get us to an Enterprise wrap up with the temporal Cold War.
mhm.
You know, even if it's not a full episode or a season, if they could even do a short trek or even one of these like longer trek movie formats, because I think they have opened up enough of the door with this one. And I think they are very intentional. The one thing I will say with the scripting, both of Strange New Worlds and even Picard season 3, they're very intentional with the scripting. They don't waste episodes or they don't waste time. And I think they made some connections here, not just as fan service, but hopefully that they have some plans to address in the future.
Well, yeah, especially with what is it, the Department of Temporal Alignment or
Mhm.
something like that, whatever it's called, which is something that we were introduced to back in Enterprise. They have to have a reason for that. I don't know if we'll go as far as, to see Scott Bakula pop in as Archer or something like that during one of these episodes, although that would be pretty freaking cool. I think I'm not sure we've heard the last of them, and I think we may run into them again in the future.
Well, and even in Voyager, where they have the future version of Starfleet with the temporal, with the time ship relativity. I'm blanking on what they called themselves, but the temporal agents with the relativity. So that even showed up there, and there were temporal agents in Deep Space Nine. So we know this bureau exists circa DS9.
Yeah.
Because they showed up after it was determined that Cisco was Gabriel Bell and said, yeah, we need to have a conversation.
Yeah, I forgot about that episode.
So, it's interesting. They're pulling in these various pieces, which I really like. So it sets some very interesting groundwork. Even the map, when they pulled out that device and they showed the timelines deviating, if you think about the displays that were on the relativity in Voyager, it's very much that same type, showing the timeline where it's diverging and the pieces.
At what point they need to go back and fix it, and how they pinpoint what date they're supposed to be going to and stuff like that. So yeah, no, I completely get it. And I really actually applaud the showrunners for doing their due diligence, or whatever you want to say, and trying to keep it as the one kind of cohesive thing, because the last thing we want is for everything to kind of, not to be throwing out more time travel puns, but for everything to start to kind of splinter off, and then we don't know what the hell's going on anywhere. So I like where they're going with this a lot.
So let's also talk about, this is another episode that brings in Carol Kane, and Scott and I have talked about this. We've been watching the reactions and the commentaries from others, and apparently Scott and I are about the only two that do not care for Carol Kane at this point in Strange New Worlds. I'm curious to get your thoughts on Carol Kane and Lieutenant Pelia.
I don't dislike the character per se. I think it makes a lot of sense you would have a very human-looking alien race discover Earth and be like, hey, we can hide out here and be safe. It's kind of like Guinan hid out among the humans for centuries and stuff like that. And I think that, so I don't dislike the character. I'm struggling to see where she fits in the overarching, or the whole show as a kind of a larger viewpoint. because like it seems like she can be there to kind of provide some comic relief here or there. I'm not sure I see her as an everyday character on the show. Maybe just very occasionally they'll bring her in. I thought her presence in this episode actually did make a lot of sense. She was kind of the perfect person who would make it just made a lot of sense for her to be there, for her being the person that they end up going there, because like she says, even like Pilia says during the episode, if you're on Earth experiencing every kind of disaster in human history, you'd be a hoarder too. In terms of, but then again, we find out she's just been stealing artifacts for centuries. And I think that's kind of a funny thing about her too, is like, not only is she kind of an information base, but she's a bit of a thief as well, just trying to make money and everything like that throughout the entire, time that she's been among the humans. And she has a lot of stolen property that, of course, now they're trying to bust her with and return to the rightful people. But so for this particular episode, I thought she fit in really well, but I'm not 100% sure how she's going to fit going forward. Like if she's a regular member of the cast, what are they going to have her do? Oh, we have this question about history. Let's go ask Pilia. And then it's going to be kind of maybe what's the right word? It's going to be maybe kind of like a typecasting going forward, where she's only going to be able to kind of be useful in certain situations. And at that point, why bother? So yeah, maybe the character will stick around. Maybe she won't. But from what I've seen of her so far, especially in this episode, I really don't have any problem with her. She's not one of my favorite characters. Like I could take her or leave her, but I don't really dislike her either.
And I think for me, again, it's the accent piece of it, but with the collection part, I think that gets the joke runs out a little bit. But for me, and keep in mind, I'm not one of these that says you cannot change canon, you can't add races, you can't do things like that. But why? I guess my issue is we have an established species in Star Trek that has this type of longevity that we know has been on Earth, which is the Elorians, the Elorians with Guinan. So why then that they created this second species kind of along that same lines with the Lanthanites? It's kind of one of those, it's like I think we had a thing there. It's why they had to create something new. But to me, the character is just annoying. And you touched on, they're trying to build these connections, because in the first episode, they made very clear, she knows Spock's mom and she has these connections with the various crew members. It's almost like they're trying to force you to feel something for the character. For me, it's like, I know Montgomery Scott's coming.
Yeah.
But at the same time, and I know we can't discuss it yet, but there's an episode coming that I will just flat out say that I think they completely wasted what they've set up with this character.
Okay. And I guess they could have very well have just written in an Elorian character to kind of fill that need for the show. But also at the same time, thinking about it from a galactic perspective, there's no reason to think that they were the only ones who are almost eternal beings or live very long, lives, thousands of years or something like that. And there could also be a very good reason from a galactic perspective as to why they don't appear in later shows or later in the timeline. Something could very well happen to that race, that they're no longer in the picture. So to me, I think they could very easily, if this character with this race doesn't work out, they could very easily write in something to where there's some kind of catastrophe or virus and, the race goes out of existence. So,
well, I'm thinking like this one in particular, and I know we've seen it with yesterday's Enterprise, but, if this was an Elorian, because we know Elorians are sensitive to changes in the timeline. I just think that could have been a better character arc. We could have explored that a bit more with Elorians. But that's just me. I mean, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong or that
I agree with you. Honestly,
one.
Thinking about it that way, actually, I would agree with you. Elorian would have been a better character to have in this episode or even in this series if they are going to have a timeline effect on it. But
so let's talk about the Khan in the room, shall we? We finally have an actual baby Khan that shows up. Khan is a child. And for the first time, Khan appears to be of Indian descent in Star Trek. This is a first.
Finally.
We have had a Latino Khan and we have had white boy Khan.
Yep. We've had actually we had a Spanish actor portraying an Indian Khan.
Yes.
But and then we had an Englishman or whatever Benedict Cumberbatch is. I think he's English. But it's actually good to see them actually use, an actor of Indian descent. And I hope going forward, if we ever do run into an adult Khan, I hope there's got to be an Indian actor who plays some kind of resemblance to Ricardo Montalban, who I think they could possibly bring in to play an adult Khan that I think would absolutely be brilliant. I would love to see it. But what struck me and what was, I think, the most chilling of that entire scene, because even though she, La'an knew she should leave, she should not walk into that room, and yet she couldn't help herself. She had to see, she had to know. So she walks in there and she encounters a small, frightened child. Very innocent. Are you going to kill me? Are you going to hurt me? And stuff like that, which was just, to me, all the more messed up, knowing exactly who this child becomes. And that's where, like, the whole thing, I know I mentioned it earlier, was everybody talks about, well, if you can go back and you can kill baby Hitler. Even Adolf Hitler was a small, innocent child at one point. And that just brings up the whole nature versus nurture argument, to where I don't really believe that either Adolf Hitler or Khan Noonien Singh were inherently evil people. That's kind of taught to you and through experience and stuff like that, to where we all know that, yes, Khan Noonien Singh was created and bred for a particular purpose, to be a superior human being, and then was taught to be the way that he was. Versus this small child who was scared, thinking that this person standing in his room was there to hurt him, especially knowing that there was a fight and somebody got shot right outside of his door. So it's definitely was kind of sitting there watching it with my jaw half hanging open, like watching this scene transgress. And it kind of put a little bit of a pit in your stomach, watching that.
And I also, like, when she asked him if he was alone and he pointed at the picture. So, because Khan has followers when they send him off Earth, when he encounters the Enterprise's spacesuit. So there's the picture on the wall with the others.
Well, and those others, I think those others are the other augments or the other genetically bred individuals who Khan ends up at war against for control of the planet. That's what the eugenics war was. Khan wasn't the only superhuman. He was one of maybe a dozen, and they all ended up controlling different parts of the planet. And then they all ended up going to war with each other to try and become, a kind of a war of supremacy. And I think that's kind of who those others in the picture were the ones that he ends up growing up with, who become his best friends. And then they all end up slaughtering each other and going to war with each other, to where by the time the eugenics war ended, Khan was pretty much the only one left. And that could be too. So it's going to be interesting, because I think they may revisit some of this. I mean, Star Trek loves to go back to Khan, and obviously with La'an in this series, we all knew Khan was going to show up eventually. You can't have that name in Star Trek and not have a Khan show up somewhere. Exactly.
Okay. So any other thoughts on this episode?
I mean, really, the only other thing I kind of had to say is I don't have really any major predictions going forward, mainly just observations. And definitely one of them was the bridge. But then the second I would love nothing more than for them to go back and touch on, maybe not in this show, but maybe in supplementary materials, like in novels or comic books or something like that, have them go back and kind of do a retelling of the eugenics wars in the current timeline. I would like to kind of see, based upon the new kind of telling of the story, how does Khan kind of rise to power? What happens to him in between when we see the small child and when he begins to kind of assert himself? And, what happens during the war? Where how does the Botany Bay end up getting shot off into space? And then maybe we'll need to have kind of like Balance of Terror. Maybe we'll have to have a retelling of Space Seed down the line if the show ends up, continuing on for several more seasons the way I kind of hope it does. But I would like to kind of, I would definitely be all up for having more Khan, or having more of kind of the backstory of kind of a retelling, a refreshing of pre-Federation history.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's the lost opportunity we had with Enterprise, because that was going to be the Romulan War.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would have been interesting to get that early Federation history out of that. And hoping,
I was so stoked for that. I was so stoked for the original Romulan War that we never got.
So I'm hoping, one of the ideas that birthed Discovery was that it will have an anthology series. So I'm hoping maybe somewhere they either go back to that anthology idea, or even look at what they're doing with this Section 31 movie and do some more of these extended stories that maybe aren't a series per se, but could be done in a, maybe a 1 or 2 movie arc, and start telling some of these stories. Because there's the whole golden era, the lost era of Trek, kind of around the Enterprise B into the Enterprise C. There's the end of Enterprise era, where they could really go back and I think do some solid storytelling along the way. And I think Strange New Worlds is opening that up. It's explaining some of the timeline. It's explaining and making canon some of these differences. Because obviously, if you think of Voyager and when they went back to Los Angeles,
mm-hmm.
and that was the one comment that's like, shouldn't this have been like the end of the eugenics wars and there they are in LA and nobody gives a damn?
Yeah, in the early 2000s, yeah.
Yeah,
and then now here we are,
late 90s, early 00s. And now you've got this kind of explaining that there's been all this interference and attempts to change things that have bumped that timeline down the road. It's still an inevitability. Time pushes back, and it's still there, just in a different way.
Yeah, and I think and then now with this episode, we're in I would assume to be the late 2020s, maybe even the early 2030s.
Mm-hmm.
And Khan is a child. So we're looking at maybe late 2030s, early 2040s before we start seeing which then compresses that pre-Federation timeline a little bit closer together, to where you have the end of the eugenics wars and a devastated planet, and end up having the rise of the Federation takes place in a much shorter time than what we originally believed. So I'm kind of curious to see how they explain that.
Yeah, it'd definitely be an interesting ride to watch that. So I think that wraps up our discussion of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, as we've looked at Star Trek Strange New Worlds' first real look at time travel as they've gone through the episode. And all in all, I think it was a solid effort put forward. This is probably one of my favorites of the season so far. Again, Scott, for those of you that have been following, Scott and I did get the first 6 screeners. This is probably out of the first 6. I would put this as in my top 3-4 episodes. I really did enjoy it. I think my favorite of the season so far, and one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek so far, is still Ad Astra per Aspera. Episode 2, still hands down for me, one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek. But this one is right up there as another good episode of this season. And I think overall Star Trek, it's got a great story and element to it. And I think it's going to help reset and guide a lot of the future discussions we have.
Absolutely. I kind of agree with you. To me, it's number 2 out of what I've seen of so far.
So this has been Exploring Star Trek, where we are going through Strange New Worlds Season 2 right now. But we do have plans to dive into all things Star Trek following this season, looking at various things from different starship classes to various seminal episodes across all eras of the franchise, and maybe even digging into the extended canon and extended materials of Star Trek, including the comic books and various games that are out there. Justin is showing off a few of those right now. He is our resident comic book guy. So until next time, let's boldly get the hell out of here, shall we?
Peace.